The soft chime of the boutique's entrance barely disturbed the quiet hum of exclusivity inside. The air smelled of polished wood and expensive perfume, the kind that whispered wealth rather than announced it. Sandra Bullock stepped in, her presence calm yet unnoticed. Dressed in dark jeans and a fitted black turtleneck, she moved with effortless grace, her expression unreadable as her fingers brushed lightly over the velvet-lined jewelry cases. Across the room, Margaret Winchester barely spared her a glance at first, but then, something about Sandra's understated look made her lips curl. White fur draped over her shoulders, diamonds glinting on every finger. Margaret was the kind of woman who believed status was worn, not earned. She tilted her head slightly and let her voice carry just enough to be heard. "Are they letting just anyone in now?" she murmured, her gaze locking onto Sandra's simple outfit. Her friend beside her smirked but said nothing. The employees didn't react, but a few exchanged knowing glances. The rich always had their way in places like this. Sandra, however, heard everything. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn. Instead, she let the weight of silence do what words never could. It made Margaret's arrogance echo louder. Margaret narrowed her eyes, tapping a manicured nail against the glass display, as if considering something far more valuable than the diamonds beneath it. She adjusted her fur coat, her voice dripping with feigned politeness. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, louder this time, enough for the nearby customers to hear. "The costume jewelry section is in the mall next door." A slow tension settled over the room. A salesman who had previously ignored Sandra straightened slightly, his eyes flickering between the two women. A customer holding a delicate bracelet paused, pretending to admire it while discreetly eavesdropping. Sandra finally moved. Not toward Margaret, not toward confrontation, but toward an emerald ring, her fingertips grazing the smooth surface of the glass above it. Her lips curled into the faintest smile, an expression so subtle it was almost dismissive. She didn't need to respond. The absence of a reaction was, in itself, a statement. Margaret stiffened, her confidence faltering for the briefest moment. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had expected defensiveness, embarrassment, maybe even a weak attempt at a comeback. But indifference, that was worse. Then, before she could say another word, the entrance chimed again. This time the air inside the boutique shifted. A presence had arrived, the kind that didn't need to be loud to be noticed, the kind that changed everything. The quiet murmur of the boutique faded into a hushed stillness, like the brief pause before a storm. Margaret felt it before she even turned, an energy, a presence that carried an unshakable weight. A man in a black jacket stepped inside, his movements effortless yet commanding. His dark hair fell slightly over his forehead, his jaw set with quiet confidence. Keanu Reeves. The employees straightened instinctively. Customers, once focused on their extravagant purchases, now stole quick glances, their expressions shifting from indifference to recognition. A subtle whisper rippled through the room, traveling faster than any rumor. Margaret's posture stiffened, but she played it off, tilting her chin as if unfazed. She had no idea what was coming. Keanu's gaze swept the store, not in arrogance, but with quiet observation. Then he saw her, Sandra. A small, knowing smile flickered across his face, the kind that spoke of old friendships and unshaken bonds. He didn't have to say a word. The weight of that moment alone shifted the balance of power. Margaret noticed. She noticed the way the employees, who had dismissed Sandra just moments ago, suddenly seemed more alert, more attentive. The way eyes lingered, the way silent judgments began to form, not toward Sandra, but toward her. Still, Margaret wasn't one to back down. She clutched the diamond necklace in her hand, turning it slightly under the boutique's golden lights. "Well," she said, forcing a polite smile, "this is unexpected." Keanu finally turned toward her, his expression unreadable. He wasn't rushed, wasn't eager to prove a point. He simply let the moment settle. Then, in a voice as steady as it was unshakable, he spoke. "Funny," he said, his eyes meeting Margaret's. "I was just thinking how class has nothing to do with expensive jewelry." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. Margaret's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly, letting out a soft, breathy laugh as if she found his words amusing. "Oh, Keanu," she said smoothly, slipping into the tone of someone who thought they were still in control. "You always did have a way with words." He didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. The way he looked at her, calm yet piercing, was enough. Sandra remained where she was, watching, her expression unreadable. But this time she wasn't the only one ignoring Margaret. The shift had begun. And Margaret felt it. Deep down she knew this was no longer her game. Margaret's grip on the diamond necklace tightened ever so slightly. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, an unfamiliar tension creeping into her chest. She had walked into this boutique feeling untouchable, believing that status and wealth gave her the right to dictate the unspoken rules of this place. But now, the rules were slipping through her fingers. Keanu hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted her. And yet, with just a few words, he had turned the entire room against her. A sales associate who had previously ignored Sandra now stepped forward with sudden attentiveness. "May I assist you with something, Miss Bullock?" His voice carried a hint of urgency, as if realizing his earlier mistake. Sandra finally turned, her gaze resting briefly on the man before shifting back to the display case. She reached out and lightly tapped the glass over a sapphire bracelet. "This one's beautiful," she said, her voice calm, unbothered. Margaret's stomach twisted. She knew what was happening. She wasn't just being ignored, she was being replaced. Still, she wasn't going to give up that easily. She lifted the necklace in her hand and turned toward Keanu with an air of exaggerated politeness. "You know, Keanu, luxury isn't just about wealth. It's about refinement, about knowing your place." Keanu tilted his head slightly, considering her words. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something almost amused. "I agree," he said finally, his tone steady. "It's just interesting how some people think refinement comes from a price tag." Margaret forced a laugh, but it came out lighter than she intended. She glanced around, searching for support, but the employees were now too focused on Sandra, and the other customers had begun whispering, their eyes darting between her and Keanu. For the first time, Margaret felt what it was like to be on the other side. The shift was complete, and Sandra, without saying much at all, was at the center of it. Margaret swallowed, but her pride wouldn't let her back down just yet. If Keanu wanted to play this game, she wasn't going to fold so easily. She just had to find the right move. Margaret refused to let this moment slip from her grasp. She straightened her shoulders, smoothing her fur coat with a practiced grace, and forced a confident smile. The weight of the diamond necklace in her hands suddenly felt heavier, as if it carried not just value, but something deeper, desperation. Sandra, still composed, let her fingertips brush over the sapphire bracelet. She wasn't in a hurry. That, more than anything, irritated Margaret. The absence of effort, the complete lack of need to prove anything. Margaret exhaled slowly, forcing another polite chuckle. "Keanu, you've always been a man of principles," she said smoothly, turning toward him. "But surely even you understand that appearances matter. The world isn't as forgiving as you think." Keanu's gaze remained steady, unreadable. "Maybe," he said, "but it's interesting how people reveal who they are when they think no one important is watching." The words landed harder than she expected. Margaret's stomach twisted, but she hid it well. She had spent years perfecting the art of control, controlling conversations, controlling the way people viewed her, controlling the atmosphere in a room. But right now the room no longer belonged to her. A subtle shift in the boutique confirmed it. Employees, once indifferent, now stood a little straighter. Customers, who had previously ignored the exchange, were now invested. Margaret could feel their silent judgment pressing against her like an unseen force. Sandra turned slightly, finally meeting Margaret's eyes. There was no hostility, no triumph, just quiet amusement. That made it worse. Margaret lifted her chin, gripping the necklace tighter. "Class, Keanu, isn't about money. It's about presence." She let the words linger, but even as she said them, she realized how empty they sounded. Keanu smirked, But it wasn't a smile. It was something more dangerous. "You're right," he said. Then, with deliberate ease, he turned to the sales associate. "She'll take the bracelet." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. The sales associate barely hesitated before nodding. "Of course, Mr. Reeves." He reached for the sapphire bracelet, already preparing to box it. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Sandra smiled, just slightly. "Thank you, Keanu," she said, her voice smooth, effortless. And just like that, the last bit of control Margaret had was gone. Margaret felt her pulse quicken, but she refused to show it. Her grip on the diamond necklace tightened as she watched the sales associate carefully place the sapphire bracelet into an elegant velvet box. Sandra didn't even glance in her direction. Her focus remained on Keanu, calm and effortless, as if this entire exchange had been nothing more than a passing breeze. That was what infuriated Margaret the most. She had been trying to teach Sandra a lesson about class and status, but somehow, without saying much at all, Sandra had flipped the entire situation. The employees were no longer catering to her. The customers weren't admiring her. The power she had wielded so effortlessly in places like this was slipping through her fingers. She wasn't going to let this happen. Margaret let out a soft, practiced laugh. "Keanu, darling," she said, her voice dripping with forced charm. "I see what you're trying to do here, and it's cute. But let's be honest, some things are simply out of place." Keanu turned to her slowly, his expression unchanged. "You're right," he said. "Like judging someone based on what they wear." Margaret felt the words hit like a sharp, invisible slap. She opened her mouth to respond, to say something, anything, but for the first time in a long time she found herself hesitating. The boutique had gone completely silent now. Employees stood motionless, their eyes darting between Margaret and Keanu. The customers, though pretending to be busy with their own shopping, were hanging on to every second of this exchange. Margaret's face grew warm, but she held her composure. "That's not what I meant," she said quickly. "I simply believe that people should present themselves in a way that reflects—" Keanu cut her off before she could finish. "Respect isn't about clothes," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "It's about character." The weight of his words pressed against her, and for the first time Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years: doubt. She glanced around, searching for silent validation from the room, but none came. Instead, all eyes were now on Sandra. Sandra, who had said almost nothing yet stood victorious, and in that moment, Margaret knew. She had lost. Margaret's breath was shallow, her mind racing for an escape, a way to salvage what little dignity she had left. But the boutique, once her stage, now felt suffocating. The whispers, the lingering stares, none of them carried the admiration she was used to. Instead, they felt like quiet judgment. Sandra, still composed, reached for the velvet box containing the sapphire bracelet. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. That made it worse. Had she rolled her eyes or dismissed Margaret outright, it would have given her something to fight against. But this was silence, and silence, Margaret realized, could be louder than words. Keanu shifted slightly, crossing his arms, his gaze still locked on her. There was no malice in his expression, just something that unsettled her even more. Understanding. He had seen right through her. Margaret swallowed hard, her fingers adjusting the diamond necklace she still held. She needed to do something. Say something. Take back control. She turned her attention to Sandra, forcing a smile. "Well," she said, her voice steady but lacking its usual sharpness, "I suppose we all have different interpretations of class." Sandra met her gaze, and for the first time she spoke directly to her. "You're right," she said, her voice smooth, unshaken. "Mine just doesn't need an audience." The words hung in the air, settling over Margaret like a slow, sinking weight. A quiet chuckle rippled through the boutique, not loud, not mocking, but just enough for Margaret to feel it. Her stomach twisted. She turned toward Keanu, searching for an ally, a way to flip the moment, but he was already looking away. "Come on, Sandra," Keanu said casually. I think we've spent enough time here. Sandra nodded, slipping the bracelet box into her purse. Without another glance in Margaret's direction, she turned toward the exit. Keanu followed. Margaret stood frozen. She wanted to say something, to call after them, to reclaim her position in the room, but she knew there was nothing left to say. The employees had moved on. The customers had turned back to their shopping. The moment had passed, and Margaret Winchester, who had once believed she owned every room she walked into, was now just another bystander. The door chimed as Keanu and Sandra stepped out into the sunlight. Margaret clenched her jaw, swallowing the bitter taste of defeat. But deep down, where the truth was impossible to ignore, she felt something far worse than embarrassment. She felt exposed, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure what to do next. Margaret stood motionless, gripping the diamond necklace in her hand as if it were the last thing tethering her to control. But control had slipped away the moment Sandra and Keanu walked out. The boutique no longer felt like her domain. It felt smaller, colder, unfamiliar. She turned, expecting the employees to rush to her, expecting the customers to restore her sense of superiority with admiring glances, but no one did. A sales associate cleared his throat awkwardly before walking away. A woman examining a ruby bracelet glanced at Margaret briefly, then returned to her shopping, uninterested. It was as if Margaret had become invisible. The realization hit hard. She had spent years believing power came from wealth, from how people looked at her, from how they envied her position. But in that moment, she saw it for what it was, an illusion, because today, no one envied her. Margaret exhaled sharply, placing the necklace back onto the glass counter with a forced grace. The diamonds no longer looked as brilliant. They were just stones. Expensive, yes, but empty. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit. Each step felt heavier than the last. When she finally stepped outside, the sunlight felt too bright, the air too crisp. Keanu and Sandra were already down the sidewalk, walking casually as if the last 10 minutes inside the boutique had meant nothing to them, but they had meant everything to her. Margaret hesitated, her pride telling her to leave, to pretend none of it had happened. But something else, something deeper, something uncomfortable, kept her frozen in place. Her fingers twitched as she reached for her phone. She opened her social media app, staring at the blank space where she usually crafted her perfectly curated posts. For the first time, she didn't have the right words, but then almost without thinking, she typed, "Today I learned that you can buy diamonds, but you can't buy class. Thank you, Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, for this lesson." She stared at the words, her thumb hovering over the post button. A part of her wanted to delete it, pretend she had never typed it. But another part, the part that felt strangely lighter than before, pressed send. The screen went dark for a moment. Then, a new notification popped up, a comment. "The first step to change is recognizing where we went wrong." Margaret swallowed. For the first time in a long time, she didn't know what came next. And maybe that was exactly what she needed.